When we think of slavery in Jamaica, a clear picture often comes to mind. We see vast sugar plantations stretching under the Caribbean sun. We envision white European masters holding absolute power over enslaved black people. This image is powerful, and it is largely true. It represents the brutal reality for hundreds of thousands of Africans forced into bondage. Yet, history is rarely so simple. Buried within the ledgers and legal documents of the era is a surprising and uncomfortable truth. Some of the individuals who owned slaves in Jamaica were not white. They were, in fact, black. This fact challenges our most basic assumptions about the clear lines of race and oppression that define the slave society. This hidden history forces us to ask difficult questions. How could a person who was once enslaved or whose parents were enslaved come to own another human being? The answer is not straightforward. It is a story of survival, ambition, and the complex human desire for security and status in a world built on profound inequality. To understand this paradox, we must first look at the system of slavery itself. Jamaica was the jewel in the British Empire's crown, a sugar-producing powerhouse built on the backs of enslaved Africans. The system was designed to be absolute, with a rigid hierarchy placing white Europeans at the very top and enslaved black people at the bottom. But even in this rigid system, cracks began to appear. The society that developed in Jamaica was more complex than a simple black and white binary. Over generations, a third group emerged: free people of color. This group included individuals of mixed European and African heritage known as mulattoes, as well as black people who had gained their freedom. This freedom could be granted by an owner, sometimes a white father freeing his own mixed-race children. It could also be purchased by the enslaved person themselves, through years of saving money from extra work. Once free, these individuals had to navigate a world that was still deeply hostile to them, a world where their rights were limited and their social standing was precarious. For some, the path to securing their position involved embracing the very system that had oppressed them. This journey from being property to owning property was a remarkable and troubling one. It did not happen overnight, and it was not available to everyone. It was a path forged by a small minority who, through circumstance, skill, or sheer determination, managed to climb the social ladder. They entered a moral gray zone, becoming part of the slave-owning class while still being subject to racial prejudice themselves. Their existence complicates the narrative of slavery, forcing us to see it not just as a story of heroes and villains, but as a human tragedy filled with complex choices made under extreme pressure. Their stories reveal the deep and corrupting influence of the institution of slavery on everyone it touched. The journey to becoming a black slave owner often began with the act of manumission, or the formal process of being freed from slavery. This was not an act of pure generosity. Sometimes a slave owner would free an elderly or sick person to avoid the cost of caring for them. More commonly, a white planter might free his own mixed-race children and their mother, often leaving them a small inheritance of property or money. This inheritance was a crucial first step. It provided the initial capital needed to build a life as a free person. With a piece of land or a small sum of cash, a newly freed person could start a small business, perhaps as a market vendor, an artisan, or a small-scale farmer in the island's interior. Another significant path to freedom and property was self-purchase. Enslaved people were sometimes allowed to work for themselves on Sundays or holidays. They could sell surplus goods from their provision grounds, hire out their skills as carpenters or seamstresses, or engage in small-scale trade. It was a slow and arduous process, requiring immense discipline and sacrifice to save enough money to buy their own freedom, which could cost a considerable sum. Once free, these determined individuals often continued to use their business skills to accumulate wealth. For them, owning property, including other people, was seen as the ultimate symbol of success and security in a society that measured a person's worth by what they owned. The legal system, while discriminatory, had loopholes that allowed this to happen. As the population of free people of color grew, they began to demand more rights. They petitioned the Jamaican Assembly for legal privileges, such as the right to inherit property beyond the established limits and to testify in court against white people. Over time, some of these rights were granted, especially to wealthier, often lighter-skinned individuals. This created a class of free people of color who could operate within the colonial economy. They could buy land, run businesses, and crucially, purchase slaves to work for them. This was not equality, but it was a foothold in the world of power. For this emerging group, owning slaves was about more than just economic gain. It was a powerful statement of their status. In a society where blackness was equated with enslavement, owning slaves was a way to distance oneself from that condition. It was a way of performing a kind of economic whiteness, demonstrating that they were masters, not slaves. They might have owned only one or two domestic servants to help in their homes or a small number of laborers to work a small plot of land. For them, it was a practical decision to secure their fragile position in the social hierarchy, a way to ensure their own families would not fall back into the brutal system they had escaped. The historical records offer glimpses into the lives of these black slave owners. One such figure was a woman named Susanna Augier. She was a free black woman living in Kingston in the late 18th century. By the time of her death, she had become a relatively wealthy individual. Her will details her possessions, which included land, houses, and most tellingly, a number of enslaved people whom she bequeathed to her children. Her story shows how a black woman could not only navigate the treacherous social landscape of colonial Jamaica, but also thrive within its economic system. She used the tools of the oppressor to build a legacy for her family, ensuring they would inherit a life of freedom and property, a life she had worked hard to secure. Another example can be found in the parish of St. Andrew, where a free black man named John Williams lived. Records from the 1820s show him as the owner of a small coffee plantation. Unlike the vast sugar estates, his was a modest operation, worked by a small group of enslaved people. Williams would have managed his property, directed the labor of his slaves, and sold his coffee beans in the local market, just like any white planter of a similar scale. His life represents the ambition of some free black men to become part of the landed gentry. He was not just a free man, he was a proprietor, a master of his own small domain, a status that set him apart from the vast majority of black people on the island. The motivations of these owners were complex. Consider the story of Mary Ann Murray, a free woman of color who purchased her own enslaved mother. This act seems at first to be one of love and compassion. She was likely rescuing her mother from a harsh life under another master. However, the legal transaction was still one of purchase. Her mother became her property. This situation was not uncommon. Family members would buy their relatives out of slavery, but the legal status of the purchased person was often ambiguous. They were owned by a loved one, living in a state that was somewhere between slavery and true freedom. Their liberty depended on the goodwill of their own child or sibling. These stories disrupt the simple narrative of a unified black community fighting against a common white enemy. The reality was far more fractured. The existence of black slave owners created divisions within the non-white population. It highlighted the vast gap between the enslaved and the free, and even between the poor free black person and the wealthy free black property owner. An enslaved person on John Williams's coffee farm would have still felt the sting of the whip and the loss of freedom, regardless of the skin color of the person who owned them. This complicated internal dynamic shows how deeply the values of the slave system had penetrated every level of Jamaican society. The presence of black slave owners had a profound and lasting impact on Jamaican society. It helped to create a complex social hierarchy that was not based on race alone, but also on class and color. Within the free population, a color class system developed, where lighter skin and wealth often provided greater privileges. This created divisions and tensions, undermining the potential for a unified front against the colonial system. The idea that freedom could be achieved through the exploitation of others became embedded in the culture. This complicated the struggle for emancipation, as some of the most successful free people of color had a vested economic interest in maintaining the institution of slavery. This history challenges our modern understanding of race and power. It shows that racial identity did not always lead to solidarity. The desire for personal security, wealth, and status could sometimes override any sense of shared struggle. Black slave owners were participants in a brutal system, and their actions contributed to the suffering of enslaved people. At the same time, they were themselves victims of a racist society that limited their own freedoms and forced them to make impossible choices. To ignore their stories is to simplify the past, to paint a picture that is comforting, but ultimately untrue. Their existence forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that people can be both oppressed and oppressor at the same time. Learning about this hidden chapter of history is crucial for understanding Jamaica today. The social structures born in the era of slavery did not simply vanish with emancipation in 1838. The legacy of the color class system, the deep-seated inequalities, and the complex relationship with power and wealth continued to shape the island's future. The shades of privilege and disadvantage that existed in the 19th century can still be seen in different forms in the 21st. By acknowledging the full complexity of our past, we can better understand the social and economic challenges that persist. It allows for a more honest and nuanced conversation about identity and justice. Ultimately, studying the history of black slave owners is not about assigning blame or diluting the horrors of slavery. It is about embracing a more complete and truthful version of our history. It reminds us that human beings are complex, and that they make difficult choices in difficult times. This history encourages us to think critically about power, how it is acquired, and how it is used. It asks us a timeless and vital question. When faced with an unjust system, do we fight to dismantle it, or do we seek to find our own small place within it? The answer to that question, both then and now, is never simple.